Today, we're going to put Lemon Squad and CarFax to the test. Hello, and welcome to Auto Be Careful, the place for car safety, news, and information. I'm Gene, and we're selling our 2017 Subaru Outback that we purchased when it was brand new. But first, we're going to get a pre-purchase inspection done through Lemon Squad and get a CarFax history report to see how accurate these services really are. Let's find out what they discover. Before we get to the pre-purchase inspection and CarFax report, I'm going to take a tour around the vehicle and point out anything that I remember that's wrong with it. Personally, I think this vehicle is very mechanically sound, so I don't expect any functional issues with it. With that said, if there were any, I would expect it to show up on the pre-purchase inspection, but I would not expect that to show up on the CarFax report. Beyond that, there are some issues with the vehicle. The first being a scratch down the passenger side of the vehicle. Unfortunately, this happened when the vehicle was pretty much brand new and someone suggested and applied touch-up paint to cover it up. After 9 years, this touch-up paint has started to fail, revealing the original damage underneath. If we were not getting rid of this vehicle, I would want to get it fixed properly, but it would be an out-of-pocket expense since it happened almost 9 years ago. I fully expect this scratch to show up on a pre-purchase inspection, but I don't expect it to show up on a CarFax report since it was never taken to a shop to get fixed. This vehicle has been in 3 separate collisions. It was rear-ended once in 2019, it was hit in the front passenger fender behind me in 2021, and it was hit again in that same front passenger fender behind me in 2022. These were all repaired at body shops, and there aren't any visible signs of damage, so I don't expect this to show up on a pre-purchase inspection, but I do expect these to show up on the CarFax history report. After the last repair, the vehicle did have to go back to the body shop to get repainted because the paint on the front bumper started to peel off on its own. So I am curious to find out if that shows up as a separate incident on the CarFax report, even though the vehicle was not damaged. Moving around the vehicle, there are various dents, dings, scratches, and scuffs, which is to be expected on a vehicle that's about 9 years old. Most of the damage to the side of the vehicle is likely from car doors being swung too wide in parking lots. Most of the damage to the front of the vehicle is likely from road debris flying down the highway, like rocks, or in one case, someone's underbody panel flying out from under their car and hitting our front bumper. There is some wear on some of the high-touch surfaces as well. For example, there's some wear around the window trim, most likely from being touched with oily hands or hands with hand moisturizer on them. There's also some scratches around the door handle area, most likely from having the door opened while there are rings on fingers. There is some wear on the built-in roof crossbars as well, although I have no idea where that's from. All of this is pretty obvious, and I fully expect a pre-purchase inspection to catch every item I listed. However, I don't expect any of this to appear on a CarFax history report because there have been no repairs done to fix these issues. One thing I'm confident neither report will show is one of the screws for the front license plate doesn't tighten, it just spins. I'm aware of this because I've changed the front license plate. However, I don't expect it to show up on a pre-purchase inspection since a pre-purchase inspection typically doesn't do any disassembly, and I don't think it'll show up on CarFax since they would have no way of knowing this information. This hasn't been an issue since it still holds the front license plate onto the front of the vehicle. However, if I wanted a more permanent fix, I would most likely have a front license plate bracket installed. Moving inside the vehicle, there is wear to some of the high-touch components, but nothing I would consider egregious. For a vehicle that's about 9 years old, this is the amount of wear that I would expect. We do transport our dog in this vehicle, so there may be some lingering pet hair, but we always used a seat protector over the seats, so it shouldn't be torn or ripped in any way. It actually might be in better condition back here than up front because it was pretty much always covered with a seat protector. There might also be some dirt and crumbs in the seats, but I do plan to vacuum it up before selling it. One thing I know is broken is the false floor in the cargo bay. I foolishly lifted it once with something heavy on top, and the extra stress of the weight caused one of the hinges to break. Unfortunately, it's not really repairable because it's held together with rivets. A proper fix means replacing the entire false floor, which costs about $200, but it doesn't really affect how the false floor functions, so I left it as is. The next owner can decide what they want to do with that. I do expect the pre-purchase inspection to catch that, but they may not. Also, under that false floor is the spare tire, and I want to talk about tires for a second. I fully expect the pre-purchase inspection to measure the tread depth and check the manufacture date on all of the tires that are mounted to the vehicle, but I'm curious to note if they'll do the same for the spare tire. Personally, I like to keep the spare tire in good condition, and it's actually the most recently replaced tire on this vehicle because the old spare was over 5 years old. But the manufacture date for that tire is printed on the side that's facing downward, which means getting the manufacture date requires taking the entire tire out of the vehicle. So I'm curious to note if they'll go that far. Before we get into the pre-purchase inspection results, I want to talk a little bit about Lemon Squad and what the process was like of getting a pre-purchase inspection through them. Let's start with Lemon Squad. Lemon Squad is a platform that can connect you with someone who can provide a service. In this case, that service is a pre-purchase inspection. This reminds me a lot of rideshare services like Uber and Lyft. With those services, I, as someone who needs a ride, would go onto that platform, and the platform's role is to connect me with someone who can provide that service, which is a ride. That person may not be an employee of that platform. The platform's role is simply to connect me with that person so that I can get the service I need. With Lemon Squad, their role is to connect me with someone who can perform a pre-purchase inspection on a vehicle. Lemon Squad isn't necessarily the ones who are performing the inspection, similar to the way Uber and Lyft aren't necessarily driving the vehicle for a rideshare. Their role is simply to connect me with someone who can do the service I need them to do. I want to mention a few things about Lemon Squad. The inspector sent by Lemon Squad isn't expected to clean or disassemble the vehicle in any way. They're also not likely to look deep underneath the vehicle. They go to where the vehicle is, which means they need to bring any equipment they want to use with them. That means they're unlikely to bring heavy equipment that's needed to lift a vehicle up in order to get a good look underneath. They also aren't expected to bring any diagnostic equipment, although they may bring an OBD2 port reader in order to check the vehicle for codes. If any of this additional information is desired, it may be better to get a pre-purchase inspection done at a shop where a mechanic can use their extra equipment in order to get a better look. The inspector sent by Lemon Squad may drive the vehicle, although this is not a mandatory part of the service. Lemon Squad also doesn't guarantee the condition of the vehicle when it is purchased. This is probably for a number of reasons, including the fact that there may be modifications or damage done to the vehicle between the time the inspection is completed and the time the purchase is completed. Additionally, there may be a failing component that was not evident at the time of the inspection, but is evident at the time of purchase. Finally, they're not looking at the history of the vehicle, so if there was any damage done to the vehicle that was properly repaired, they're not likely to find it. For that type of information, it can be helpful to get a vehicle history report. Next, I want to talk about the experience of getting the inspection. As I mentioned earlier, the inspector goes to where the vehicle is, which does mean that it limits what the inspector can look at. However, the part I didn't mention is that it's incredibly convenient for the seller. In fact, in my experience as a seller getting this inspection done, it was just as convenient as meeting a buyer to look at the vehicle. The reason I want to highlight this is if a seller has reservations about getting this type of inspection done, it could be a red flag. A more in-depth inspection requires a bigger time commitment from the seller because they have to take the vehicle to the shop where the inspection is performed and possibly wait 1 to 2 hours while the inspection is completed. There is a bit of trade-off in the level of detail, but for me, if a seller isn't even willing to get a Lemon Squad inspection done, I don't think I would pursue that vehicle. Let's go over our inspection timeline. I placed my order for a Lemon Squad pre-purchase inspection as a vehicle buyer just after 9 p.m. on day 1. On day 2, around 10:30 a.m., I received an email from Lemon Squad indicating that my pre-purchase inspection was scheduled to be completed on day 3. Moving over to the seller's perspective, 1 hour after the buyer received that email, the inspector contacted me as the seller to set up a time to look at the vehicle. We agreed to meet at 2 p.m. and the full inspection was done with a test drive in 40 minutes. That means the inspection was completed on day 2 by 3 p.m. and the inspector submitted the information about the inspection to Lemon Squad for review at 9:30 that night. After that, it was a little bit of a wait to get the final report. I contacted Lemon Squad on day 4 to ask about the report, and after that call, it was sent to me within 10 minutes. Part of me does wonder how long it would have taken had I not contacted them, but at this point, we'll never know. There are a few things I want to highlight about this process. The first is, I didn't love that they sent the buyer an estimated time for the inspection to be completed prior to the inspector and seller agreeing to meet to inspect the vehicle. Lemon Squad does make it clear that this is an estimated time, so it's not a big deal, but it is something I would keep in mind as a buyer. Secondly, as I mentioned, diagnostic tools and a test drive are not mandatory parts of an inspection. The inspector did bring an OBD2 port reader in order to check the vehicle for codes, which I thought was great, but the inspector did not do a test drive on the vehicle. Instead, they asked me to do the test drive while they sat in the passenger seat. This can give the inspector a good idea about how the vehicle behaves, but it's not as comprehensive as them driving it themselves. I was told this was because of insurance needs, but it is something to keep in mind as a buyer. I am really curious to see how they notate that on the inspection report. Overall, I was really impressed with how quickly this process was completed, although that can vary depending on the seller and inspector's availability. Based on this, I would definitely recommend a Lemon Squad pre-purchase inspection as a minimum when buying a used car, especially if you're not getting your own eyes on it. All right, let's look at the inspector's report. On the outside, they noted the car presents well with cosmetic imperfections. They noted paint chips, curb rash, and a crack on the passenger turn signal mirror. Now to me, that crack looks more like a scratch, but it is damage either way. They also noted a cracked wheel, which I personally had not noticed, but there is a piece of material missing from the outer layer of the rim. I would describe it more as a chip than a crack, but either way, it's damage. They also noted the Michelin Cross Climate tires have plenty of tread left. On the inside, they noted wear consistent with age, but no rips, stains, or odors. They also noted the trim is intact and the controls that they tested work properly. Pretty much all of that I expected. Mechanically, they noted the engine starts and runs smoothly, no observed leaks, the belts, hoses, and wiring are in good condition, and no reported codes from the onboard diagnostics. They also noted a short road test performed by the dealer showed normal steering, braking, suspension, and transmission operation with no warning lamps. They did note corrosion on the negative battery terminal, low coolant in the reservoir, and dark brake fluid. I wasn't aware of those specific issues, but they're not very surprising to me, and my personal opinion is that they're not huge mechanical problems to fix. Overall, I was pretty impressed by the thoroughness of this inspection, although there are some things I think should have been included. The first is, I didn't see anywhere in the report that there was a scratch on the passenger side of the vehicle. That would be a pretty huge miss if it wasn't properly disclosed and could cause a dispute later on after the vehicle sells. The inspector did take a photo of the spare tire, but they only notated the tread depth of the 4 installed tires, and they didn't notate the manufacture date of any of the tires. There is a section called tire condition in which they wrote no issues on the 4 installed tires, and I imagine that's where the manufacture date would be notated if it was an older tire, so I'm not super concerned about that. The inspector did not notate the broken hinge on the cargo area false floor, which could be pretty disappointing to a buyer, but it doesn't prevent the false floor from being used. As I expected, they also did not notate the spinning screw on the front license plate. However, they did find a few other issues I wasn't aware of. So I think it was helpful in some ways, but the results may vary based on a variety of factors. And as a seller, I would still want to disclose anything that wasn't noted just to make sure there aren't any issues after the sale. Next, let's talk about CarFax. CarFax is more or less a data gathering and reporting entity, and a CarFax report is a compilation of all of the data they have about a specific vehicle. The data they gather can be from a variety of sources, including the manufacturer, each state's Department of Motor Vehicles, insurance companies, and repair shops. The information listed on the report includes some data about the vehicle configuration, including the engine, as well as if the vehicle is front-wheel drive, rear-wheel drive, or all-wheel drive. It also includes a bunch of other information, like where the vehicle has been registered, where it's been repaired, what repairs are done, recall information, and warranty information about the vehicle. It's a great tool to look at the history of the vehicle, but like I said, it doesn't include everything. For example, not every repair shop reports data to CarFax, so they may not have information about every repair done to the vehicle. Also, it doesn't say much about the current condition of the vehicle. For example, if a vehicle has been damaged but not taken in for repair, it's unlikely to appear on this report. This report is also unlikely to show if the vehicle has been modified. For that type of information, it's helpful to get the pre-purchase inspection. Looking at the CarFax report, there aren't any surprises listed here. The report lists all 3 collisions, although the dates are slightly different and appear to be based on when the vehicle was brought in for repair rather than when the collision actually occurred. Otherwise, the collisions reported seem pretty accurate. Unsurprisingly, the report doesn't include the scratch on the passenger side of the vehicle because it was never brought in for repair. There aren't any surprises with the maintenance history here either. There are a few records listed on the report from which I don't have records from the shop, and a few things that aren't listed on the report from which I do have records from the shop. There is a record of having the fuel filter replaced because I requested it from the dealer based on the service interval, but the dealer declined to provide the service because they didn't see any issue with the filter. I also don't see anything specifically mentioning that the vehicle was upgraded from 3G connectivity to 4G connectivity. This doesn't surprise me based on the report because it seems like all of the descriptions that CarFax uses are pre-filled, like oil changes, brake replacement, or tire rotations, and there isn't really a pre-filled description for this type of service because it's not very common. Overall, this is a really good look at the history of the vehicle, with some slight inaccuracies, but it can be really helpful when buying a used car. So that's a look at 2 tools that are available when purchasing a vehicle and how accurate they were for our 2017 Subaru Outback that we've owned since it was brand new. Stay tuned as we go through the process of selling this vehicle, then we'll reveal what vehicle we purchased to replace it. As always, thanks for watching. I hope you learned something. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to click the like button below and subscribe to see more content like this.